I'm Allison. I'm a reading specialist and the author of the blog Learning at the Primary Pond. And tonight I'm super excited to chat with you about some terms that get thrown around a lot rather, when we're talking about reading instruction. And those terms are read aloud, shared reading, and guided reading. So we're going to go over not only what they mean and what the differences are between them, but some little nuances. So whether you're brand new to these terms or you've been teaching for 20 or 30 years, I hope that this will just kind of inspire your thinking and we can have a nice little conversation about how we might even use these instructional strategies in a different way than you might normally think that they would be used. So if you're joining me, I see we have a number of people in here already. Awesome. I would love for you to say hi and let me know what grade you're teaching. It's a little hard for me to see the comments because I'm not wearing my glasses and the computer's a little bit far away, but it is always helpful to know what grade you're teaching and maybe even where you're watching from. So feel free to comment, feel free to ask questions, and I'll definitely stop and answer questions as well. So before we get into really talking about these three terms, I kind of want to talk about them as a whole. So read aloud, shared reading, guided reading. These are instructional routines. And we use instructional routines to get at a goal, right? Like we want to teach our students how to decode, how to comprehend. We want them to have good reading fluency. We have maybe standards or a curriculum that we're teaching. So these instructional routines help us get at our goals, but they're not an end in themselves. Like we don't do guided reading just to do guided reading, right? These are tools. And you probably know that already, but the reason I bring this up is because I feel like, our school days are so packed, and many of us, maybe we're even required to by our district, many of us just are cramming like instructional routine after instructional routine into our day. There's far more than just this when it comes to reading instruction, right? Like haven't even talked about phonics, although you can do some of that in all of these, word study, spelling, whatever you want to call it. And then there's writing and so many other things. So anyway, my point is when we're thinking about these routines, I think it's always helpful to view them as tools and not something that we have to just like rotely go through every day, because that's kind of how I used to view them. And it's taken some like shift in my thinking for me to focus on the fact that like I have goals, I have my students' needs, I'm trying to teach real little children here, and I have my standards and stuff that I have to meet. And these things are in my toolkit, but they're not an end within themselves. So hopefully that makes sense. I hope that you have some flexibility in your schedule to not have to, if you don't have time for shared reading one day, like the world's not gonna end. Stuff like that. I hope you have the flexibility, and I know it really depends on your school, to really use them to your and the kids' benefit and not feel tied to them just for the sake of like checking things off the list, if that makes sense. Hey, Vicki, Giselle, Andrea, Diana, welcome. So glad you're here. All right, so that little kind of up on my soapbox, that little rant aside, let's really dive in and talk about what these three things are and the differences between them. So the way I broke this down is we're going to talk about how long I usually spend on each of these things, and it can vary, what skills I typically cover with each routine, what my role is, what the student's role is, and then how difficult like the level of the text is. So if you can't read this, no worries. I will be talking from it, so no worries if you're on your phone or anything like that. I will still say what's on this chart, but I'm just using this to kind of break it down here. So read aloud, just in a nutshell. Read aloud, you're reading a book to kids. It's usually got some good language and vocabulary that they can learn from, but you're not really asking the kids to read. Maybe you're asking them questions, asking them to think, pair, share, but that's what a read aloud is. You've probably done a read aloud before. Shared reading. Shared reading is a little bit different because you and the kids are sharing, hence the name, sharing the work of decoding and comprehending the text more. Now, are the kids helping with comprehension in the read aloud? Yes, but in shared reading, they're actually helping you ideally read the text. They need to be able to see the text, whereas in read aloud, they're not necessarily going to be able to see the words. And then guided reading in a nutshell, that is where you have your small group. Text is just a little bit hard, and you're guiding them so that they can be successful in a text that's pretty close to their independent reading level, but just a little bit harder. And they're doing more of the work in guided reading, because in Read Aloud, you're doing all the work. In shared reading, it's shared. And in guided reading, yes, you're maybe introducing the text and helping them a little bit, but it's really their job to read. So in a nutshell, those are the three. Now let's go, little thing by thing here and talk about first the time frame. So Read Aloud generally is, sometimes my Read Alouds just take too long. I have to watch my time, but I would say like 10 minutes is a good amount of time for a Read Aloud. If you are like, okay, I'm trying to read aloud this book and also teach the skill and talk about the meaning of the text, it might be that you need to break that up into 2 lessons, because I know when I first started teaching, my read alouds would last, way more than 10 minutes because I was trying to do too much. So remember, you can always just read a book for comprehension. We're talking about it a little bit, but then maybe you come back with it and teach a strategy the next day. Is it okay to teach a strategy while you're doing a read aloud? Of course, but just consider your kid's attention span, right? And how long you have in your overall literacy block for that. Another thing you can do is you don't necessarily have to finish the whole book, depending on what kind of text it is. So if you want to work on a strategy, or you want to specifically model something that takes a little bit longer, then you could do half the book one day and half the book the next. So read aloud's usually about 10 minutes. Let me just scroll and make sure everything looks good in the chat. Hey, Dolorosa. All right, so shared reading can also take 10 minutes with my second graders, and I'm really talking K2, by the way. That's the grades I do work with, actually technically up through 5th grade, but as a primary teacher, I've always been in K2, so I'm really talking about K2 here, and if you teach above that, you might have to adjust what I'm saying. Shared reading, 10 minutes I feel like for kindergarten is good. Maybe up to 15, 20 maybe for like second graders or on up. And then for your guided reading, it honestly depends how much you're putting in your lessons, right? The actual reading of the book will really vary depending on how difficult the text is, how long the text is that you're reading with the kids. But for the group as a whole, I would say anywhere between 10 and 20 minutes. I know some teachers do like a 25-minute group because they're also doing a lot of writing. But again, it totally depends on your classroom and what you're putting into that, guided reading little block there. So that's timing. Now let's talk about what skills we might cover in each routine. And there is for sure some overlap, right? Like you will be rather teaching comprehension as you're doing a read aloud, but you can also teach the same skill or comprehension skill with shared reading, because whereas in a read aloud, you might be doing more modeling and guidance and just asking questions, during shared reading, you might be asking the kids to more actively participate in the comprehension. Well, like, what strategy should we use here? What should we do next? And then with guided reading is where, in addition to independent reading, you're really asking the kids to apply what you've been working on with a little support, with much less support than you would be, for example, if you were doing a read aloud. So anyway, there's a little overlap. In read alouds, I tend to work on comprehension, vocabulary, and then fluency, in the sense that I'm modeling fluency whenever I read aloud to my kids, right? Like I'm using the different voices, I'm reading smoothly, and I may point out like, hey, did you hear how I changed my voice for this character? I don't usually ask my kids to read along per se, because they may be able to fill in words. What I like to do is if they know the book or it's a repetitive thing, I might stop and have them fill in a word. But generally speaking, because they can't see the text, or at least a lot of the kids can't see if we're on the rug, I don't really ask them to read along, but I might point out some things I'm doing to be a fluent reader, if that makes sense. So that was read aloud. Now let's talk about shared reading. All the skills for shared reading: decoding, fluency, comprehension, vocabulary, print concepts for my kinder and first grade teachers. Just, at this time in the year, a lot of our kids need to learn to point under each word and read left to right. And what else do we work on? We work on just the first, where's the first word in the sentence? Where's the last letter in this word? All those things are great to work on during shared reading, because you are displaying the text so that they can see it. And that can be a big book, but it doesn't have to be a big book. It can be a regular book under the document camera so they can see it. Or maybe you have like ebooks that you have access to, and so you display that on some type of projector or your interactive whiteboard. Typically, I like to have the kids all looking at one version of the text. I know that with like a lot of Basel series, like with what we had when I first started teaching, all the kids would have a copy of it. And, you know, I feel like that's okay. But what's nice about having all the kids just looking up at one thing, number one, you can tell if they're paying attention a little bit better. And number two, you can draw their attention to things more easily. Because if you've ever had all kids looking at a text at the same time, you know that it can be a little bit more challenging when you're like, okay, find this word or find this sentence. It can work, but I just find that it's faster if they're all looking at one copy of the text and I can point things out and highlight it. It runs a little bit smoothly, at least with primary, which again is what we're focusing on tonight. So print concepts, I kind of got off on a tangent there. Phonics, you know, this is not your only time to teach phonics, of course, but are you getting the kids to apply what they're learning in phonics to their reading? Yes, absolutely. Like this is where you encourage them. Oh, they can see a word. Well, what word, you know, what spelling patterns do you notice? This is when, you know, this connects to what we worked on in spelling or phonics or word study. So you're bringing that in. High frequency words too. Shared reading texts are a great way to introduce or review high frequency words, or just to get the kids to notice like, hey, we're learning these high frequency words during this time of the day, and now we're actually applying them to our reading. And I think that's all I listed for shared reading, although do let me know if I've missed anything in the comments. And if you'll notice here, the real difference between what you're working on, between like comprehension and, between the read aloud and shared reading, it's because in shared reading, the kids can see the text, and in the read aloud, they can't. So you can't really work on phonics too well unless you, of course, are taking the read aloud text and like putting words on cards and putting them in a chart or putting them on the board. In that case, you can. But generally speaking, when I'm doing a read aloud, we're focusing on comprehension, just enjoying a book. And so that's why I tend to use more like shared reading opportunities to work on things like phonics, because they can see the text. And another advantage is with read alouds, of course, there's going to be words that the kids will know, but the level of the text, which we'll get to in a second, is a bit higher. And so for that reason, the words that they are working on are going to be more likely to be found and more accessible to them in the shared reading book, because it's going to be a little bit easier in difficulty. Hopefully that makes sense. And then as far as skills go for guided reading, same as shared reading, basically. The real difference here is in shared reading, you are doing more of the work. You know, like with my kindergartners, I'll read the big book to them typically the first day of the week, at least this early on in the school year, I definitely do. So I'm doing a little bit of the work and they're joining in later on. They're joining in certain parts. But with guided reading, maybe I introduce the book to them. Maybe I read them one page, but for the most part, they're reading on their own, right? And so this is the time when you can bring in, oh, we talked about this strategy in shared reading. Like, this is a good place for you to apply it to. So it's basically the same kinds of skills, but you're just giving them a little bit less guidance, if that makes sense. When we think about gradual release of responsibility, you know, you're modeling most of the stuff in the read aloud, so I do. You're doing it together in shared reading, we do. And then guided reading is kind of like we do, but it's more of a you do. And then of course, independent reading, which is not listed here, is when kids are taking all of this stuff and being asked to apply it on their own. So that's the differences that I see in skills to cover. And again, let me know if I missed any. Teacher's role. Okay, now let's talk about what you're doing during each of these instructional routines, because it is a little bit different. And this is where I think, like for me, I know this, right? But sometimes it's just important to like re-examine and rethink about it, because I find myself sometimes doing too much of the work like in guided reading. So if you've been doing these instructional routines for 20 years, I always think it's worth revisiting it and just thinking like, well, how much work am I doing? Because there's a difference between how much work you should be doing in the read aloud and the shared reading and guided reading. So during the read aloud, you're going to maybe introduce the book. You're going to read the words to them. You might think aloud. That's something I do frequently in read-alouds to work on comprehension. And it doesn't have to be like this whole big thing. It's just like, right now I'm wondering what the character's gonna do next, or now I'm thinking about how the character did this, or now I'm wondering, why the author said that stars are whatever, if it's nonfiction. So I'm doing a little bit of thinking aloud. I'm modeling. Again, we talked about, I'm modeling good fluency. I'm maybe modeling comprehension skills or strategies. Right now, for example, right now I'm confused. I'm reading this and I just don't know what the author is saying. So I'm going to go back and reread again. You can model stuff like that during a read aloud. The kids, maybe they can suggest strategies, but it's more of a teacher modeling kind of opportunity. So other things you're doing, of course, are asking questions and encouraging the kids to engage with you, engage with their peers. That's also something that I do in a read aloud. Shared reading. So during shared reading, again, you might introduce the book. You might read aloud the book. Like I said, with kindergarten, especially at the beginning of the year, I'm going to read the text probably all the way through because they can't really read it yet. And even with some of the older grades, the first read, you may be doing a lot of the work because the text is a little bit difficult for them, more difficult than a guided reading book would be. So you are still doing some of the read aloud work, at least the first time. Excuse me. You're doing some modeling. And the nice thing about shared reading is that when you're modeling, the kids can actually see the text. So if you're modeling, comprehension stuff during a read aloud, that works well because they're like hearing the story or hearing the book and they're following along. But I wouldn't necessarily model like decoding a word during a read aloud unless I were to just take that book and stick it under the document camera so they can see what I'm talking about. Because it doesn't really help if they're hearing me like sound something out if they're not also seeing the print on the page. So shared reading is a great time to model things like, decoding skills, using phonics knowledge, all that good stuff, high frequency word knowledge. Often during shared reading, I will focus on one teaching point or strategy. So for example, one day we might take the shared reading text and we are going to work on the fluency strategy of reading in phrases and not just like word by word. So that might be our focus. You can also have a focus during a read aloud, right? Like maybe you're working on asking questions or something different, but your focus could be the same. You can talk about asking questions in shared reading, but with shared reading, that's when I grab onto more like fluency, decoding strategies, things like that. With guided reading, my role is as a teacher to introduce the book. Although sometimes I like to help the kids introduce the book to themselves because, traditionally, yes, in guided reading, you introduce the book, but when the kids are reading on their own, you're not going to go up to them and be like, hey, Sammy, this book is about X, Y, and Z. Sammy's just going to pick up the book and start reading. And so even though it's good to introduce the book in some occasions, I also think it's important to teach the kids how to introduce themselves to the book. And by that, I mean that they can preview the book, look through it, look at the cover, read, like a few of the pages or a couple of the words. Those are the kinds of things that we work on when we're previewing a book for ourselves. Kind of a tangent, but also when you're working with the kids during guided reading, you want to help to activate prior knowledge, by asking a question. Sometimes I will have like a super short YouTube clip or something like an image that I'll pull up on my iPad and show the kids to get them thinking about the topic. Super important with English language learners, especially. During guided reading, my role, once I've introduced the book, is not to read the book with the kids at the same time, unless I'm doing that for a specific purpose with readers that, like your pre-A readers and they're not able to read on their own yet, or a higher group and you're tackling part of a text or a text that is really hard for them. But generally speaking, the kids are reading on their own. Where are we here? So then as the kids are reading on their own, I will listen in. My thing that I do is I kind of will like tap very lightly. I know you can't see this, tap very lightly in front of them. And then they'll know that they can raise their voice so I can hear them a little bit more, because ordinarily they're just whispering or even silent reading at some of the higher levels like J, I, above. So I'm listening to them read. I might suggest a strategy. More often than not, though, I'm just encouraging them to figure out what strategies to use. And this is where thinking about your role in the guided release of responsibility is so important, because sometimes I do too much teaching in guided reading when, teaching is necessary in guided reading, right? Like it's not like it's just a free-for-all, like they read the book on their own and you give them no help. But I've already done a lot of teaching in my read aloud and my shared reading, and so sometimes I have to pull back and be like, okay, you need to let the kids do their thing, because if you're thinking about the gradual release, this is like right before independent reading, not chronologically, but like the least amount of support before independent reading. And so if you're still giving them a ton of support during guided reading, they might struggle during their independent reading because you're doing so much. Hopefully that makes sense. So during guided reading, listen to the kids read. Of course, try to get them discussing the book afterwards, although it is nice to have discussion leaders who maybe do a little bit more of the work as the year goes on, as you teach them how to do that, how to work together to retell. It's nice to give them more responsibility. And then you also, after the lesson, maybe you're doing leading some writing or word work or what have you. That will really depend, again, on what you include in your guided reading lessons. So that's our role as the teacher. And then the student's role. So the amount of participation, and this kind of, just goes with the whole gradual release thing we've been talking about, but the amount and the type of participation that the kids engage in will just depend on, your class, the grade that you're teaching, but also which particular instructional strategy you're using. So during a read aloud, kids are typically listening, asking questions, ideally answering questions. I like to do a lot of turn-in talks. Frequent turn-in talks are good to make sure that the kids are, following along and get a chance to share their ideas. I do, do the traditional raise your hand if you know the answer to this question, but more kids get an opportunity to talk when you include frequent turn-in talks. During shared reading, it's a little bit different because, again, they can see the text, so they may be reading along with you. With second graders and up, I feel like I don't always want to have them read along. Sometimes it just kind of feels awkward. Sometimes I want to model things. So with them, it may just be that they're reading only parts and they're not reading the whole thing with me. But again, it depends on your kids. It depends what you're working on. During shared reading, the kids, I like to get them to suggest strategies, because yes, you might be modeling something, you might have a focus strategy, but this is a chance for the kids to think about like all of the strategies they know and suggest strategies for the class to try. So you're decoding a word, for example, and you're having the kids try to figure out what it is. Kids should be suggesting, once they know different strategies, things to try to decode that word. Kids are trying out strategies with your help, and again, they're asking and answering questions. Turn-in talks are helpful here too, especially when you're working on a comprehension focus, although shared reading naturally gets the kids more involved than a read aloud because the kids are typically reading along with some or all of it. And guided reading, the kids' job is to read the text mostly on their own, use strategies, and discuss the text afterward. And then, of course, ask and answer questions. And I try, like I said before, to get the kids taking as much responsibility, getting as involved as they can. I try to pull back, and naturally, I want to do a lot of teaching during guided reading, but I want to see what they can do and support them in that. All right, last but not least, and we kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning, text difficulty, right? Like what level of text are you going to pull for each of these instructional routines? Because it does matter. With a read aloud, of course, you can read aloud book at any level. Sometimes we're just reading aloud for enjoyment, and that's great. But generally speaking, you want to grab something that's above the kids' reading level, because this exposes them to higher level vocabulary, like more complex language, generally speaking, the texts that I choose for Read Aloud are significantly harder than what like an average kid in the class can read on their own. Now, do we want them to still be able to comprehend it with our help? Yes. But you also want it to, you're giving them access to that rich literature that they might not be able to decode on their own, right? Because imagine if you, for your kindergartners the whole year, you know, maybe they learn some CVC words, but imagine if you just give them books that only have CVC words in them. Are they going to learn higher vocabulary? No, like that may be what they can read on their own. So this is your opportunity to expose them to that language, to that vocabulary that they wouldn't otherwise get access to. So that's why I choose a harder level text for Read Aloud. Shared reading. For shared reading, I like to choose a text that's slightly above my kids' level, but still accessible to them with my help. And this is so great in preventing kids from getting stuck at guided reading levels, because if you pick like an average kid in your class, say like, oh, like most of my kids are at a level F, then maybe I'll pick like a level G text, maybe a level H text, and you're helping them be successful in a harder text, but you're not giving it to them on their own because they're getting your help. They're seeing how to navigate those harder levels, but they have your support. And so that makes the transition when you're moving kids up a guided reading level in their group, that makes that transition easier because they've already been exposed to those texts. They've already like gotten your help in decoding and comprehending them. So I used to think that the text level didn't really matter for shared reading, but now I feel like it does matter. And do you always have to have a 100% perfect match? No, I sure don't, but I think it's helpful to aim for that. And also, if you have a big range in your class, sometimes you may want to, do a little bit of a harder book one week and a little bit of an easier book the next week. All right, last but not least, in terms of, text level for guided reading,